The silence that followed was unlike anything the Osbourne family had ever known. For decades, the world only saw the chaos, the laughter, the profanity, and the madness that came with being the Prince of Darkness. But behind the walls of his Beverly Hills home, a son stood helpless, watching his father slip further and further from the world. Now, at 39, Jack Osbourne is finally ready to break the silence. For the first time, he opens up about the death of his father, Ozzy Osbourne, a man worshipped by millions but remembered by Jack as something far simpler, his dad. What he reveals is not the story of a rock god, but of a man's final days, filled with pain, regrets, laughter, and love. This is not just the end of a music legend. This is the story of a son who had to watch his father fade away, and of a family that will never be the same. Long before Jack Osbourne was old enough to understand the weight of a last name, the world had already crowned his father a living myth. Ozzy Osbourne, the boy from Aston, Birmingham, who clawed his way out of poverty, became the Prince of Darkness. From the first scream on a Black Sabbath stage to the solo career that turned arenas into temples of chaos, Ozzy was more than just a man. He was a force of rebellion, the soundtrack of fear and freedom rolled into one. And for Jack, that was the burden of childhood. Imagine growing up knowing your dad was not only famous, but infamous. Other kids learned fairy tales about monsters. Jack lived with one who walked the earth, a father whose image was built on biting the head off bats, shocking governments, and terrifying parents around the world. But in the kitchen at home, Ozzy was just dad, shuffling around in slippers, pouring cereal, making jokes that didn't always make sense. Jack remembers being torn between two worlds, the father who tucked him in at night and the rock god who belonged to everyone else. Schoolyard bullies knew who he was before they even knew his name. Teachers whispered, friends bragged, strangers shouted his father's lyrics across the street. There was no escape, no chance to just be a normal kid. He was born into a circus where the spotlight never turned off. And yet, in that shadow, Jack also found his greatest teacher. Ozzy, despite his demons, gave his children one lesson above all else: survival. He had survived addiction, survived fame, survived public humiliation, and he never stopped fighting, even when the world expected him to fall. Jack often said that his father's greatest rebellion wasn't against the church, the press, or even music critics. It was against death itself. Every time Ozzy should have gone under, he clawed his way back, gasping, broken but alive. That spirit shaped Jack in ways he never understood until much later. Still, being the son of the Prince of Darkness came with wounds. Jack often felt invisible, his life written as a footnote in someone else's epic saga. He loved his father, but he also resented the shadow that swallowed his own identity. And yet, as years passed, he realized something shocking. The world's Ozzy and his Ozzy were never the same man. The one who terrified millions was gentle, vulnerable, even fragile. That split reality was both a gift and a curse. And, as Jack now admits, it prepared him for the hardest chapter of all, the moment when the shadow that had loomed over his entire life finally disappeared. When the Osbournes premiered in 2002, no one expected it to change television forever. For Jack, barely in his teens, it meant his family was no longer his own. Overnight, the quiet dysfunction of their Beverly Hills mansion became America's favorite soap opera. The cameras captured everything: the arguments, the swearing, the laughter, and the chaos. To the outside world, it was hilarious, groundbreaking, raw. But for Jack, it was a microscope, exposing wounds the world was never meant to see. Viewers saw Ozzy stumbling through sentences, mumbling half-coherent thoughts, shuffling around the house like a confused grandfather. They laughed, they mocked. But Jack remembers the private truth. His father was already struggling, already carrying the weight of years of abuse, addiction, and hidden health problems. What the audience thought was a comedy was, in Jack's eyes, the slow unraveling of a man who was both exhausted and vulnerable. And if Ozzy was exposed, so were his children. Jack grew up live on MTV. His awkward teenage years played out for millions of strangers. Every insecurity, every mistake, every private fight was immortalized in reruns. The world saw him as the angry, rebellious son who couldn't control his temper, the kid who lashed out at his mother, the one who seemed destined to crash just like his father. What no one saw was the crushing pressure of being the son of the world's most infamous rock star, trapped in a house where every door hid a camera crew, every whisper was recorded, every tear was turned into entertainment. Sharon, always the backbone, tried to control the chaos, but Jack remembers her silence when the cameras stopped rolling. She was tired, worn down, carrying not just the show, but the family itself on her shoulders. For Kelly, it was the same. Her identity became a performance, her pain broadcast as punchlines. Jack often admits that what the Osbournes gave them in fame, it stole in privacy. It tore their family open, left wounds that would never fully heal. Even after the show ended, Jack could never walk into a room without someone quoting a line, mocking his father's slurred speech, or reminding him of his own televised breakdowns. He came to realize that fame was a thief and that his family had been robbed in plain sight. Still, in those chaotic years, there were moments of strange beauty, nights when the cameras were gone, when it was just the four of them sitting around the table, laughing like any other family. Jack holds on to those memories because, as he would later confess, they became rare. By the time the world had laughed its fill, the Osbournes were left scarred, their private struggles magnified, their family bond tested in ways no one outside could ever understand. And for Jack, that experience was more than just a reality show. It was a rehearsal for grief, a crash course in watching someone you love deteriorate while millions of strangers laugh. It was, he says, the beginning of the end. Ozzy Osbourne had been dancing with death for decades, but for Jack, those battles were never just headlines. They were nights of terror in hospital waiting rooms, phone calls in the middle of the night, and whispered prayers that his father would survive just one more time. The world saw the legend, the survivor of drugs, alcohol, and rock and roll excess. Jack saw a man whose body had become a battlefield. It began long before the Parkinson's diagnosis. Years of addiction had already left scars, trembling hands, slurred speech, memory lapses that made him seem like a ghost, even while alive. Jack remembers watching his father fall down the stairs, crash into furniture, wander confused through the house, and wondering if this was the end. Then came the accidents, like the 2003 ATV crash that nearly killed him. To the fans, it was another shocking headline, another reminder of Ozzy's chaotic life. But for Jack, it was a nightmare. Standing at his father's bedside, tubes and machines keeping him alive, not knowing if the man who once commanded stadiums would ever speak again. Jack was barely 18, but already old enough to realize his father was mortal, fragile, breakable. As the years passed, the hospital visits became routine. Sharon would try to hold the family together. Kelly would crack jokes to keep the fear away, but Jack couldn't ignore the reality. His father was slipping, piece by piece. Then came the news no son ever wants to hear. In 2019, the family went public with Ozzy's Parkinson's diagnosis, but Jack had known long before. He saw the stiffness, the trembling, the difficulty walking. He knew the monster his father had spent a lifetime outrunning had finally caught up. Parkinson's was different. It wasn't an overdose or a crash you could recover from. It was a thief that stole slowly, relentlessly, day after day. Jack said watching it was like standing on a beach and seeing the tide drag your father out to sea, knowing there was nothing you could do to stop it. Yet through it all, Ozzy refused to quit. He went back on stage, pushed himself through pain, insisted he could still sing, still roar, still be the Prince of Darkness. And fans cheered because they saw the warrior spirit. But Jack knew it came at a cost. Every performance drained him. Every tour broke him down further. Every night ended in exhaustion and silence. Behind the curtain, the man who once screamed to the heavens could barely whisper to his son. And still, Jack admits, he clung to hope. Because Ozzy had cheated death so many times before, why couldn't he do it again? He was the man who survived overdoses, survived crashes, survived everything fame and fortune tried to destroy. He was the unkillable rock star. But as Jack now reveals, by those final years, he could no longer deny the truth. The Prince of Darkness was losing the war, and every battle was only delaying the inevitable. By the time the last days came, the Osbourne home no longer felt like the chaotic circus the world remembered from television. It was quiet now, too quiet, filled not with laughter or music, but with the hum of medical equipment, the shuffle of nurses, and the soft sobs that no one wanted to admit were happening. Jack remembers it with painful clarity. The atmosphere was heavy, every hallway a reminder that time was running out. Sharon moved like a ghost through the house, determined to stay strong but carrying a grief that leaked through her silence. Kelly tried to hold on to hope, cracking jokes, distracting Ozzy with old stories, but even her laughter couldn't drown out the fear. Jack, however, could not escape the truth. He had seen this decline coming for years. Every fall, every tremor, every blank stare pulling his father further away from him. And now, the man who once stood unshakable on stage could barely rise from bed without help. Doctors came and went, their faces grave but professional. They spoke in low voices, carefully measured words that felt less like advice and more like countdowns. Jack hated them for their calmness. How could they speak so plainly about a man who was not a patient, but his father, his hero, his best friend? Some nights Ozzy would rally, cracking a joke, singing a few bars of an old song, even laughing at the absurdity of his situation. And for a brief moment, the family could pretend everything was fine. But those moments grew fewer, and soon all that remained were long hours of silence, broken by the sound of labored breathing. Jack admits that the hardest part wasn't the illness itself, it was the waiting. The waiting for a phone call in the middle of the night, the waiting for a knock on his bedroom door, the waiting for that final breath that everyone dreaded but knew was inevitable. He tried to stay strong, but he would sit by his father's bed staring at the man who had once been larger than life, and wonder how someone who conquered the world could now seem so small. He says it felt like watching the sun set forever, knowing it would never rise again. The house was filled with memories, walls lined with gold records, photos of world tours, magazine covers, and trophies that told the story of a life lived louder than most could ever imagine. Yet none of it mattered anymore. The music, the fame, the fortune, none of it could stop what was happening. Ozzy, the man who had survived everything, was finally facing the one enemy he couldn't outsing, outfight, or outdrink: time. And so the Osbournes braced themselves for the inevitable. No one said it aloud, but everyone felt it. Jack knew the end was near, and though part of him wanted to scream, to fight, to demand the universe give them more time, another part of him whispered that maybe, just maybe, it was time to let his father rest. Because even legends grow tired, and even the Prince of Darkness deserves peace. It was late, the kind of late when the world outside is asleep, and every sound inside the house feels louder, heavier, final. Jack remembers the weight in the air that night, the stillness that wrapped around the Osbourne home like a shroud. He had felt it building all day, the unspoken dread, the knowledge that this was the night they had been waiting for, but could never truly prepare themselves to face. The nurses moved softly, almost reverently, whispering to one another as though they too understood the gravity of what was about to happen. Sharon stayed close, her hand never leaving Ozzy's, her silence saying more than any words could. Kelly had tears streaming silently, her usual laughter replaced with a kind of quiet resignation. Jack stood nearby, torn between wanting to run away from the moment and wanting to hold on to every second of it, terrified of what came next, but unwilling to miss the last breath of the man who had defined his entire life. He remembers staring at his father's face, the rise and fall of his chest slowing, the sound of the machines keeping rhythm like a cruel metronome counting down the seconds. There was no grand speech, no final concert, no roar to the crowd. It was fragile, intimate, painfully human. Ozzy's eyes opened briefly, unfocused, but searching, as if he wanted to say something but couldn't. Jack leaned close, whispering that he loved him, that it was okay, that he didn't have to fight anymore. And then it happened. The breaths grew shallower, weaker, until finally there were no more. The machine beeped once, then silence. A silence so heavy it swallowed the room. Jack says, that moment felt like the world itself stopped, as if every sound, every heartbeat, every thought was suspended in grief. The Prince of Darkness, the man who had terrified nations, inspired millions, and outlived every demon thrown his way, was gone. Jack felt his knees give way, the weight of the truth crashing down on him, crushing, suffocating. He had known it was coming, but knowing does not soften the blow. Sharon wept quietly, clutching her husband's lifeless hand, while Kelly buried her face in her arms. Jack sat frozen, staring, unable to process that the man who had once seemed indestructible was now still forever. He says the strangest part of that night was the emptiness that followed. No thunder, no lightning, no drama fitting for a rock god's departure. Just silence, thick and merciless. The world outside remained unaware. Fans slept in their beds. The city lights flickered as usual. But inside that house, the universe had changed forever. Jack would later say, it felt like watching the final chapter of a book slam shut, leaving him with only memories and the unbearable task of living in a world without his father. In the days that followed, Jack Osbourne drifted through a haze of disbelief and exhaustion, the kind of grief that doesn't arrive like a storm, but seeps in like fog, slowly, relentlessly, until it suffocates you. He had always believed his father was indestructible, the man who survived overdoses, car crashes, stage accidents, and the brutal demands of a career that should have ended him a dozen times over. But now, that illusion had shattered, and Jack was left staring at a reality he wasn't ready to face. He tried to be strong for Sharon, who clung to routine as if planning funerals and dealing with phone calls could shield her from breaking apart. He tried to be strong for Kelly, who alternated between hysterical laughter and uncontrollable sobbing. But when he was alone, Jack fell apart. He describes those moments as a collapse of everything he had been holding together for years. The pressure of living in his father's shadow, the weight of fame, the endless scrutiny, all crashing down at once. He would wake in the night and think he heard his father's voice calling his name, only to be swallowed by silence. He would walk into the living room, expecting to see Ozzy sitting in his chair, muttering nonsense and laughing at the television, only to be met by emptiness. He admits that for the first time in his life, he didn't know who he was without his father anchoring him, guiding him, even in the most chaotic ways. Jack had always played the role of protector, even when he was just a boy, shielding his father from the world, explaining away his stumbles, defending him against critics. Now, there was no one left to protect, no one left to fight for, and the void consumed him. He turned to old habits, nearly spiraling into the very addictions he had fought so hard to escape, because numbing the pain seemed easier than facing it. The phone never stopped ringing. Management, press, friends, musicians, all demanding statements, all wanting to know how the family would carry on. But Jack couldn't answer. What could he say that would make sense of losing a man like Ozzy Osbourne? How do you put into words what it feels like to lose a father who was also a legend, a cultural icon, a man whose absence left not just a family, but an entire world in mourning? Jack describes it as standing in the eye of a hurricane, everything spinning violently around him while he was paralyzed in the center, broken, voiceless, and numb. He admits there were moments when he wanted to disappear, when the pain seemed too much to carry, when the thought of a life without Ozzy felt unbearable. But then, he remembered something his father used to say in his more sober moments: when life tries to kill you, tell it to piss off and keep going. Those words, simple and crass as they were, became Jack's lifeline. Even in death, his father's voice echoed in his head, reminding him that survival was the ultimate rebellion. It didn't erase the pain, it didn't heal the wound, but it kept him standing when everything inside him screamed to fall. News of Ozzy Osbourne's death spread across the world like wildfire, and almost instantly the air seemed heavier, as though the planet itself was mourning. Jack remembers waking up the next morning, and seeing headlines on every screen, his father's face plastered across televisions, phones, and newspapers, the words, "Prince of Darkness dead," echoing everywhere. What had been a private family tragedy was suddenly a global event, and Jack found himself caught between two realities: the grief of a son who had lost his father, and the surreal spectacle of millions grieving a rock legend. Fans poured into the streets, lighting candles outside venues where Ozzy once played, gathering at the gates of the family's mansion, leaving flowers, notes, and Black Sabbath posters. Across social media, hashtags trended worldwide, tributes flooding in from people who had never met him, but swore his music had saved their lives. Jack scrolled through thousands of messages, some from fans who had been with Ozzy since the 70s, others from teenagers who had only discovered his music on streaming platforms, yet all united by the same raw heartbreak. It was overwhelming, almost alien. To the world, Ozzy was the untouchable god of metal, the man who redefined rock, the wild spirit who laughed in the face of authority. To Jack, he was just Dad, the man who shuffled around the kitchen in pajamas, muttered jokes no one understood, and called him on the phone just to ask about his day. Reconciling those two versions of the same man was harder than Jack could have imagined. Tributes from fellow musicians poured in, from Metallica to Paul McCartney, from Elton John to younger artists who credited Ozzy for paving the way. Jack remembers sitting with Sharon, watching the television as one rock star after another told the world how much his father meant to them, and feeling a strange mix of pride and sorrow. Pride because he knew his father's legacy was secure, sorrow because none of it could bring him back. Even politicians weighed in, with statements about Ozzy's cultural impact, his role in shaping music history, his defiance against the establishment. Yet the most powerful tributes came from the fans themselves. Tattooed men crying outside concert halls, mothers telling their children about the first time they saw Black Sabbath live, strangers singing Crazy Train in unison in candlelight vigils across continents. Jack says it felt like the world was throwing the biggest funeral in history, a celebration that spanned countries and generations. But inside the house, the Osbournes sat in silence, watching the chaos unfold. For Jack, it was surreal to see millions of people crying for the man he called Dad, when all he wanted was one more conversation, one more laugh, one more moment. He realized then that his father didn't just belong to him or his family, he belonged to the world. And while that realization was painful, it was also strangely comforting, because it meant Ozzy would never really be gone. His voice, his music, his defiance would live on in every fan who played his songs, in every band that carried his influence, in every soul that found strength in his chaos. But still, Jack admits, no global mourning, no tribute concert, no candlelight vigil could fill the empty chair at their dinner table or silence the ache in his chest. The world had lost a legend, but Jack had lost his father, and that is a grief no stage could ever contain. Jack Osbourne says that in the end, his father's legacy cannot be measured in gold records, ticket sales, or headlines. Those things tell part of the story, but they don't capture the essence of the man he knew. To the world, Ozzy Osbourne was the Prince of Darkness, a rebel, a madman, a rock god who shocked the establishment and terrified parents. But to Jack, he was Dad, flawed and fragile, loving and frustrating, hilarious and heartbreaking, a man who carried the scars of his demons but still found ways to make his children laugh. When Jack finally spoke about his father's death, he admitted the hardest part was separating the myth from the man. Fans wanted to believe Ozzy was immortal, a supernatural figure who could never die. And in some ways, Jack understood, because he himself had once believed it. But in those quiet moments by his father's bed, he saw the truth. Ozzy was human, vulnerable, a man who had fought battles most would not survive, but who still, in the end, could not outrun time. And yet, that humanity is what makes his story so powerful. Jack believes his father's greatest legacy isn't the music, though the music will live forever. It isn't the outrageous headlines or the chaos of his public image. It's the example he set of survival. Ozzy fell 1,000 times, but he always got back up. He made mistakes that could have destroyed him, but he kept moving. He faced ridicule, illness, addiction, accidents, and despair. And still, somehow, he endured. For Jack, that resilience is what he carries with him now. The voice in his head that tells him to keep going when life feels impossible. He says his father's death taught him something unexpected, that endings are not really endings at all. Because in every fan who turns up the volume on Paranoid, in every teenager who discovers Black Sabbath for the first time, in every stage where a band screams against the establishment, Ozzy's spirit lives on. He left behind more than a catalog of songs. He left behind a blueprint for defiance, for chaos, for honesty, for surviving even when the world tries to break you. Jack admits that grief still lingers like a shadow he can't escape. There are mornings he wakes up expecting a phone call from his dad. Nights when he thinks he hears his voice echoing in the house. Moments when the silence is so heavy he feels crushed by it. But then he remembers the lessons, the laughter, the strange wisdom his father offered in between the madness. He remembers the love, the flawed but undeniable love that bound their family together even when everything else was falling apart. Jack has vowed to carry that legacy forward, not just by protecting his father's name, but by living with the same raw honesty that defined him. He wants his children to know the grandfather they barely got to experience, not as a rock star, but as a man who loved deeply, who fought relentlessly, and who, even in his darkest moments, never truly gave up. He says the world will remember the Prince of Darkness, but he will remember the father who called him son, the man who sat at the dinner table, the voice that told him to keep fighting when everything seemed lost. And in that memory, Ozzy is still alive. The world may have lost an icon, but Jack knows the truth. Legends never really die. They live on in the music, in the stories, in the blood of their children, and in the hearts of those who refuse to let them fade. For Jack, saying goodbye was impossible because you cannot truly say goodbye to someone whose spirit is woven into the very fabric of who you are. So when asked what Ozzy's death means to him, Jack says it means this: the end of a chapter, not the end of a story. The Prince of Darkness may be gone, but his shadow will never leave us. And for as long as his music plays, for as long as fans scream his name, Ozzy Osbourne will remain eternal.